Sitting U.S. President Donald Trump's top general foresees acute risk in attack on Iran. According to General Dan Caine, the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman has cautioned that the lack of munitions and support from allies could mean greater danger for U.S. troops. People familiar with the discussion say. But meanwhile, in Pentagon meeting this month, General Caine also has raised concern about the scale of any Iran campaign, inherent complexity, and the possibility of U.S. casualties. What do we know about the situation between U.S. and Iran at this moment? Again, according to the social media post after the sitting U.S. President Donald Trump, that it is America's job to liberate the people in Iran. Now, the question we really need to think a bit harder is this just a political rhetoric, or it's U.S. ready to engage with the nation of Iran? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Jamsheed Choksy. Professor Choksy is a distinguished professor. He is a former chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, former chair of the Department of Central Eurasian Studies. He is a current director of the Eurasian and Uralic National Resource Center at Indiana University at Bloomington. Well, Professor Choksy, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you, Will.
Well, again, Professor Choksy, as I mentioned before, now, before taping the show, I want to read a couple news headlines to you because those things are rather alarming for international community. For example, news headline says, America doesn't need a deal or a war with Iran. Or the next one, it says, what would a war with Iran look like? And this is the most, we'll say, attractive one. It says, the U.S. is dangerously misreading Iran. Professor Choksy, this is not the first time you and I would discuss the tension between U.S. and Iran at this moment. But again, according to sitting U.S. President Donald Trump, the U.S. is ready to engage with the nation of Iran, especially from the military perspective. But the generals around President Trump strongly advised him not to take actions, especially without the involvement of allies. Now, let's start with the first question. What do you say to that? Now, is U.S. ready to engage with Iran? And also, how dangerous is the situation at this moment? Your thoughts?
That's a very good question, Will. So, firstly, let's keep in mind, yes, indeed, military supplies are always limited and have to be replenished. And it has not been that long since the United States both bombed Iran and protected Israel when Iran attempted to strike back against Israel. And of course, protect the United States' own assets in the Middle East. That took a lot of munitions, and those are in the process of being resupplied. The United States also has a military presence around the globe. And so to launch any war anywhere means one has to withdraw assets from elsewhere. These assets take time to move. So this is one of the reasons why there has not been a war so far. The United States has been moving assets into place. The question, of course, if you're a military planner, is whether it is worthwhile squandering those assets in attacking Iran now or keeping them for a later date. In addition, the situation in Iran has become far more complicated since the last protests. The protests were the strongest, most violent protests ever, violent in terms of the way the government quashed the protests. And instead of taking the win, the Iranian government has proceeded in almost, shall we say, a Stalinist fashion to quash any last remaining bits of opposition. But it has not succeeded. Protests continue. There have been university protests even in the last couple of days in Iran. And the government continues to, shall we say, become smaller and smaller in terms of supporters and more violent. And their backs are to the wall. And the reports are that Khamenei, the supreme leader, has now instructed that there be 4 layers of replacement in case the regime is decapitated by the United States. So the Iranian government has been planning. The other dangerous factor, perhaps the most dangerous factor for the United States, I would argue, is not even the lack of munitions, but the fact that the Iranian regime's back is to the wall. And its back is to the wall not because of the United States, but because of its own people. It has run out of time with its own people, and so it knows it either has to continue to be increasingly authoritarian or fall. And so it is survival, both internally and externally, and that makes it very dangerous. Essentially, Khamenei and the government, to use a metaphor, and I don't mean it in a derogatory sense, but they're like cornered animals, and therefore they are going to fight back.
Professor Choksy, again, according to the report or according to the expert and the belief, an attack on Iran could further also strain U.S. relationships with the regional allies. And again, a senior Persian Gulf official told the Washington Post recently that Arab countries have informed Washington that they would not allow their bases to be used for a strike against Iran. Iran's threat to retaliate against any country that supports the U.S. operation has also raised questions about Washington's ability to secure flyover rights. Now, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, let's talk about this. Again, let's break it down. Experts believe, or according to the senior Persian Gulf official, that Arab countries have informed that Washington that they would not allow their bases to be used for strike against Iran. What would be the reason behind that? And also, why is this getting way more complicated than what we are seeing in the news and also what we have heard from Donald Trump? Because based on the recent interview, that again, Donald Trump is very bold and would say outspoken about how people in Iran are living in hell, and there have been more than 32,000 people died under the current regime. So U.S. it's time to take a step in and also to support the people in Iran. But meanwhile, we're getting the different reactions around the allies and also from the Persian Gulf officials. So what do you say to that?
So it would appear that I think we should view the responses of the nations around Iran, particularly the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, those immediate countries. Certainly, they are the ones who Iran can strike back against, even more effectively than trying to reach American warships. So they are afraid. However, those countries also know that they are under the United States security umbrella. So I think what we are seeing here, my response is based on past actions. One can never predict the future, but on past actions. These countries have always said, no, 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 the United States should not do this. We will not allow our airspace to be used, etc. But then, when push comes to shove, they have been involved, not directly, but they've permitted the United States to use the bases, to use the airspaces, to intercept missiles, etc., ultimately for their own security. So this is also part of sort of, shall we say, the rhetoric of those countries, both publicly and privately, while on the other hand, knowing the reality that if there was a war, they cannot avoid it, and they'd have to count on the US security umbrella, and therefore they'd have to let the United States use their facilities. So I think there's the reality, there's the illusion. But of course, yes, they would prefer a negotiated settlement, just like Russia and China would prefer a negotiated settlement. And if I may say so, I think that President Trump would also like a negotiated settlement. And while President Trump continues to talk about the Iranian people, he's also made it very clear that he's willing to accept a very narrow nuclear and ballistic missile deal. And the Iranians have said that they're willing to give him access to oil and infrastructure and redevelopment. So the possibility of a deal is very real. I think what we are seeing is very heightened pressure on both sides. This evening, United States time, President Trump will address the American nation in the State of the Union address. It'll be interesting to see. He almost certainly will mention Iran. I'm sure there'll be threats. I think this is also to mount the pressure on Iran to accept a deal. Now, will such a deal benefit regional and global security? Perhaps for a few years, in holding Iran's nuclear and ballistic missiles back for a few years. Will it help the Iranian people free themselves of a draconian regime? No.
Well, Professor Choksy, since you mentioned China and Russia, let's bring both countries into our conversation. Again, according to the latest piece from the Wall Street Journal, and this article, which is entitled, Under Trump Pressure, Iran Finds Its Friends Are of Little Help. Both China and Russia have forged closer ties with Tehran, but have shown little willingness to provide military aid in a conflict with the U.S. Now, of course, Professor Choksy, when we talk about China, when we talk about Russia, we're looking at two major powers. And again, we're looking at not only from this political perspective, but also from this economic standpoint. But let's get to the question. According to the article, this is what we read. It says Beijing and Moscow have shown little willingness to provide direct military assistance if President Trump does order attack on Iran, end quote. Why are we seeing that? I mean, we know, again, let's not talk about China for 1 second. Let's just talk about Russia and Iran for a second. Since the war in Ukraine started out, and we know that this military partnership or this diplomatic relationship between Russia and Iran grew way much closer. I mean, this is not a surprise to the world. So this is a desperate situation for Iran and also for the regime. Now, Iran is not asking for a olive branch. Iran is asking for support and help. But why Russia it's offering little supply or even say little willingness to provide military in this conflict? Is Russia trying to save its own base when the war in Ukraine continues? Or Russia is trying to figure out different plans without provoking US and Iran at the same time? What do you say to that?
I think all the points that you have mentioned are valid. So Putin's main concern is Ukraine. And he needs to keep his resources there because for him, ideologically, Ukraine is part of Russia, Iran is not. Iran is important because it's one of Russia's few remaining allies in the Middle East after the fall of Syria. However, it is not worth bolstering Iran militarily in terms of either munitions or in terms of troops and giving up Ukraine. For Putin, there is, I would say, no choice there. In addition, he already is taking on Trump in terms of negotiations with Ukraine. Why add Iran to that calculation? So I think Iran finds that despite all the deals, and there's a recent deal that Iran has to receive more anti-aircraft missiles and all the rest from Russia. That sort of technology may come, but very slowly, if and when Russia has it to spare. But right now, no. Iran is essentially on its own. It may be able to draw a little bit on Hezbollah, but Hezbollah can very quickly be pushed down because it has been decimated. Iran can draw upon the Houthis, but they also can be pushed down. The paramilitaries in Iraq, those will be regional troublemakers. But essentially, shall we say, the regime of the Ayatollahs is on its own, its back is to the wall, its people are against it, and that perhaps is the most important thing to keep in mind. It is, shall we say, almost deliberately attacking its own people to survive. So I think Russia, in that sense, is out of the picture. They will not intervene militarily.
Well, let's talk about another perspective. Again, we know that openly that for Moscow, aligning with Tehran could pose or could raise major concerns from the U.S. perspective. But we know that, Professor Choksy, let's talk about this relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So far, again, we're looking at this complication of the war in Ukraine. And Donald Trump placed way too much air quote trust in Putin to minimize the threat. But so far, again, based on the report from Ukraine or the interview under the current Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, that Russia should not be trusted because Putin is not trustworthy at the same time. So let's talk about the situation. I mean, again, you mentioned that Russia it's not ready to engage, or Russia is not ready to supply with Iran. How much do you think that from the Russian perspective, they also need to think about the presence of Donald Trump when Donald Trump is still trying to solve the war in Ukraine? So in other words, by engaging with with Iran, do you think that Putin is actually basically just cutting the lifeline of the U.S. is basically saying, hey, I'm going to side with Iran and I don't need a U.S. or I don't care what you do to me anymore since, you already done so much sanction on me. Is anything play that in that part?
He can publicly side with Iran as he does. However, right now he doesn't have the resources to support Iran. He has to draw those resources from Ukraine. And so I think that for his fundamental calculation is Ukraine or Iran, he cannot run both wars. And that is, I think, for him the central problem. And maybe that is to the United States' benefit right now, the reality that at this point, with the war in Ukraine dragging on, Russia cannot be involved in another war. Just as we saw, Russia did not step up to save Assad. They saved Assad and his family personally by taking them to Moscow, but they did not attempt to save the regime because they didn't have the resources. So I think at this point, Russia will be present rhetorically. They may be present at the United Nations in favor of Iran. Worst comes to worst, they may provide some Iranian leaders with refuge, exile in Russia, but I don't think that they will be involved in large-scale supply of munitions, and certainly I don't see Russian troops or Russian fighter jets taking to the air to cross the Iranian airspace and take on the United States.
Professor Choksy, two more questions before letting you go. Now let's talk about China. We know that today China is Iran's biggest oil customer and also an important market, preventing its heavily sanctioned economy from collapsing. Also, we know that Iran seemed to grow so much closer to Beijing, especially when we look at this economic reciprocity. Now, we understand that based on what you just said or analysis, Russia cannot afford to supply additional resources to Iran. What about Beijing? Again, based on the report, that Beijing shared with Tehran a desire to counter U.S. power, but fear that aligning too closely with the Islamic Republic could jeopardize the relationship in the Persian Gulf region. And also keep in mind, Professor Choksy, Donald Trump is expected to visit China either at the end of March or the beginning of April. This is a crucial step for both countries. So my next question, instead of asking you the cliche, do you think that Donald Trump is really looking for a deal when he comes to Beijing, but before the trip takes place, he's very wise and careful not to damage the relationship with China and then wanted to see how China is reacting to the Iran situation? Your thoughts?
That's a good question. And the calculus, therefore, is, does Donald Trump eventually wait to see the outcome of his trip to China before he makes a decision on Iran? I don't know. I will say this, that the decisions could very well be independent because for the United States and for China, their relationship, whether it is troubled or smooth, is far more important than Iran. Yes, Iran is a major supplier of petrochemicals to China, but that is merely because it is cheap. Iran sells cheap fuel. China can obtain that fuel from Saudi Arabia, from other places. The relationship with the United States is far more important, far greater, just as the United States' relationship with China. And I think we are seeing that by the very nature that Donald Trump is willing to make a trip to Beijing. And so what I think, again, what we'll see is that, yes, China would like the Persian Gulf to be stable, as you pointed out, for economic reasons. Is China going to be militarily involved? No. China will do everything it can to try to facilitate a settlement. If there is a battle, certainly I don't think that China would shed any tears if Iran were to deplete American military assets in the region. But would China get directly involved? No. Does it have the capability right now of getting involved? No. So there again, and why would ultimately China want to merely for economic reasons support a regime whose own people are turning against it? So if you look at a long-term calculus for Beijing, a long-term calculus is also balancing both the current regime with which it has economic, diplomatic, and political ties, and the very real likelihood that that regime will not endure in the long run. And therefore, it does need the goodwill of the Iranian people. So that also, I think, has to be an increasing calculus among the policy planners in Beijing as to how do we navigate Tehran while remaining in contact and supporting the regime and using the regime to balance American interest in the Persian Gulf, while ensuring that in the long run, you still have the goodwill of the Iranian people.
Of course, I mean, again, the voices of the Iranian people are so critical. I mean, again, that's the whole thing got started in the first place. It's the frustration and also the anger from the people and within the circle that turned up the heat and eventually that drew the attention of the world. Now, Professor Choksy, I want to end our conversation by reading a simple statement from the Iranian supreme leader that he made recently regarding the relationship, especially deal with the West and deal with the East. This is what he said, and I quote, "As Iranian government, we should look east, not west." End quote. We know the words are not just the words to be translated on the screen. And we know that when we look at the political rhetoric, there's something it's deeper than what we just heard. So, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, is this sort of I don't want to use the word confirmation, but it looks like a solution for the Iranian government try to get away from the US and try to tell the world to say, hey, the West, it's gone. Instead, we need to look the East. But we don't know what the East that means. You know, could be countries, could be resources, or could be military support, or could be any economic possibilities. But again, because Iran is sitting at the crossroads today, so I want to get your final reaction. How do we interpret such rhetoric? And what does that mean that for Iran, we should always look to the East, not to the West? How much will that hurt the West? Your final thoughts.
My final thoughts on that go back to your statement just now. Iran sits at the crossroads. The reality historically, even if we go back to the 5th century BCE, the rise of the Persian Empire, Iran has been at the crossroads. It looks east, it looks west. West comes through to east, east goes to west. And I would argue that that perhaps echoes the failings of the supreme leader and the Iranian regime. The regime and the leader have had for 40 odd years an opportunity to connect East and West, to be central. Instead, it has become more and more isolationist. Its allies are not cultural allies. They're allies for economic needs, and they're allies because they are friends against so-called mutual, so-called enemies. They don't really have true allies. And that, I would argue, is the failing of a country that could indeed, as you said, be central to the region economically, politically, culturally, something as we know, we've talked about the Silk Road. We've talked about Belt Road. All those flow ultimately through Iran. And Iran could have truly regained its international position. And instead, it is the links with China ultimately, the fact that it can provide China with petrochemicals. If China were to find a very reliable, cheap source of petrochemicals, it wouldn't need Iran. And it is very possible. And let's also keep in mind the Persian Gulf waterways are increasingly not necessary because pipelines are being built across Saudi Arabia to places like Oman to ship the oil directly and gas directly into the Gulf Arabian Sea and then onto China. So pretty soon, Iran may indeed be out of the picture. So I think the failure here is that, yes, the Supreme Leader can talk about looking east. The Supreme Leader should actually be looking east and west and reaching a deal. Iran long talks about wanting only civilian nuclear energy. Well, then, make that a reality by opening your program up, making sure everyone is assured. I would argue that the fundamental reason we are here at, Donald Trump would have no case for bombing Iran if, number one, the regime was fully supported by its own people, and number two, the regime was involved with the global community.
Well, again, Professor Choksy, it's rather complicated, and also it's not easy for us to understand this whole rhetoric behind Donald Trump. But again, as we mentioned before, as we're seeing how the Iranian people are suffering today, it's devastating to see what's happening in Iran, but also, as the general advised President Trump, that it's better to think twice before we take any actions. Because again, at this moment, U.S. cannot afford to involve in another war, but meanwhile, all the complications of the crisis and the wars already make the world more anxious than ever. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Jamsheed Choksy. Professor Choksy is a distinguished professor and a former chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and he's currently the director of the Eurasian and Uralic National Resources Center at India University at Bloomington. Well, Professor Choksy, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention and also monitor this ongoing relationship between U.S. and Iran. And thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much as well.